Today, we are wading into the gloriously chaotic world of a figure who proves that having an astronomical amount of money and absolutely zero common sense can sometimes be, well, the same thing.
We are talking about Timothy Dexter.
Lord Timothy Dexter, if you please.
Right, Lord Timothy Dexter, a man whose life story basically challenges every economic, social, and, well, even literary rule of the late 18th century.
It really does. And our mission today is a high-stakes one. We're going to sort through this incredible, often contradictory history to figure out if he was genuinely the world's luckiest idiot, this, fortunate fool who defied all laws of probability,
But something else entirely.
or if he was actually something far more interesting, maybe a true pioneer of conceptual performance art, personal branding, and just weaponized absurdity.
And the reason we're diving into this now, of all times, is because history is kind of catching up to the myth. There's a major, very recent development that puts his entire weird world into sharp focus.
It's fantastic. The 9-foot wooden statue of William Pitt the Elder.
One of his originals.
One of his originals, commissioned centuries ago for his infamous mausoleum, as he called it. It has finally found its permanent home.
It was on loan from the Smithsonian for decades, but just this past January, right? The permanent deed was transferred to the Museum of Old Newbury.
It's home. It's a literal 9-foot monument to his legacy, securing his place in history just a few blocks from where he originally erected it. And that legacy it's pure paradox.
Completely. You have this semi-literate, basically uneducated farmhand who somehow amasses this immense overnight wealth.
And not through shrewd calculation, not in the way you're supposed to, but by repeatedly making investments that were so spectacularly terrible.
So bad that his own rivals dreamed them up specifically to bankrupt him.
Exactly. We are going to unpack the almost mythic absurdity of these ventures. I mean, how he managed to successfully sell coal to Newcastle, a feat so pointless it literally became an idiom.
And warming pans to the tropics. Thousands of them.
Yeah.
And he profited every single time. It sounds like a bad joke, but for Timothy Dexter, it was just life.
But you have to remember the stakes here. In the 1790s, when he rose to prominence, American society was deeply entrenched in class snobbery and tradition.
Very much so.
Dexter's story is so compelling because he represents this fundamental failure of the elite to control the narrative of wealth and success. He became a self-made celebrity who just ignored the rules, and the sources show us he did it with this incredible theatrical flair.
Okay, let's unpack this story then. Let's start right at the beginning of the chaos, back in colonial Massachusetts, where his future wealth was forged from, well, desperation. So Timothy Dexter was born on January 22, 1747, in Malden, Massachusetts. And to say he started low on the social ladder is a massive understatement.
Oh, absolutely. His family was poor, modest Irish and English descent. His whole trajectory was pretty much laid out for him. And his formal education, what little there was, ended abruptly at age 8. It's a critical detail. He wasn't just poor, he was structurally disadvantaged. At 8, he's indentured as a farm servant for 6.5 years, so his entire formative education isn't books, it's manual labor.
And you think that lack of formal schooling is what really drove him?
I think it fueled his obsessive, lifelong need to prove his worth and his intelligence to the established, educated elite that always, looked down on him.
But he did have a knack for practical skills. By the time he was a teenager, 14 or 16, he moves into the leather trade in Charlestown and Boston.
Now, a leather dresser was considered a lower-class job, for sure. It's not high society. But it was absolutely essential work.
Especially at that time.
It was a trade of high demand, specifically because of the Revolutionary period's need for military supplies and durable goods. He specialized in crafting sought-after materials, things like Moroccan leather for gloves and moosehide breeches.
He learned the value of a solid, tangible product.
He did. And when he completes his apprenticeship at 21, he gets the traditional freeman suit, which marked his entry into adult society. He could vote.
But instead of wearing it to his first town meeting, he immediately sells it for $8.20. What does that tiny transaction tell us?
It's pure Dexter, even at that age. It tells you he was fundamentally focused on capital and liquidity over status symbols. I mean, $8 doesn't sound like much, but it was cash in hand. A little piece of capital he could deploy. He was prioritizing investment over social presentation long before he became Lord Timothy Dexter.
His real financial foundation, though, that was built on his marriage. In 1770, he marries Elizabeth Frothingham.
A wealthy widow, 9 years his senior with 4 kids.
This was not a romance.
Oh no, it was the ultimate strategic merger for a man looking to climb. It provided everything he lacked. Property, a shop, and most importantly, the crucial starting capital he needed for speculation. He could stop making trousers in a basement and start playing the high-risk game of the merchant class.
And this brings us to the moment everyone pointed to as the first real proof of his idiocy, the Continental currency gamble.
Right. After the Revolutionary War, the Continental dollars printed by the new government were, famously, completely worthless. You couldn't buy bread with them.
That's where the phrase comes from, right? Not worth a Continental.
That's it. The common wisdom was simple. Dump the notes. The wealthy, educated, sensible merchants were offloading them for huge losses. They were historical relics. John Hancock might buy a few as a symbolic gesture, but that was it.
Dexter, however, decides to ramp that gesture up into, well, what looked like an extreme act of financial suicide.
He took all of his savings and his wife's considerable capital and bought boatloads of these depreciated bills for literally pennies on the dollar.
Can you just imagine the reaction from the knowing ones at the time?
Utter disbelief and mockery.
No.
His peers thought he was a fool, a bumpkin who understood nothing about macroeconomics. They thought he was doomed to ruin himself and his wife. They basically calculated his loss before anything even happened.
But they missed the political reality unfolding.
They did. And this is where the specific historical context just makes his story explode. In the 1790s, the U.S. Constitution is ratified. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, launches his plan to assume all the debts and establish the credit of the new nation.
So the government is going to make good on this old, workless currency.
They are. The federal government offers to redeem it, often at a percentage, to show good faith. But, and this is the key, in Massachusetts, the state had already made commitments to pay off their notes internally.
So they were in a unique position.
A very unique position. It meant that when Hamilton's plan went into effect, Massachusetts holders often found their notes being redeemed for the full face value.
Full face value. On notes he bought for almost nothing.
He didn't just make a profit. It was an overnight exponential windfall. The amount of wealth he amassed was staggering. It solidified his fortune, and critically, it validated his belief that he had some kind of inherent genius that the so-called knowing ones lacked.
He succeeded precisely because he was too ignorant to follow their common sense advice.
It created the first and maybe most important layer of the lucky fool legend.
But money doesn't buy class, and it certainly didn't buy him respect in Malden. Despite his newfound wealth, he's still constantly petitioning his hometown for a seat in public office. He's desperate for that social recognition.
But he's still seen as an uncouth upstart. His crude rhetoric, his lack of education, the establishment just couldn't stomach it. The irony is so rich, he had defied their financial rules and won, but he just could not win their social game.
So the authorities, just exhausted by his constant nagging, decide to engage in an early form of political trolling just to shut him up.
And the solution they came up with is just, it's brilliant. It's so ridiculous. They created a completely pointless, bespoke position just for him.
They named him the official informer of deer.
The informer of deer. Think about the level of organized mockery required to create a governmental office dedicated to tracking a non-existent animal population.
Because the sources confirm this task was utterly absurd. The last known deer in that specific area had died 19 years before the office was even created.
A job with a 0% chance of success. And this detail, I think, is maybe the most revealing of Dexter's tenacity. He didn't quit. He took the job seriously. He held this completely redundant office for 12 consecutive years.
12 years.
From 1776 to 1788. He was diligent in his absurdity. He would not be deterred, even by outright political scorn. He clung to the title because it was a title, and that was enough to legitimize his status, at least in his own mind.
So he's rich, he has a title, but he still can't break that impenetrable social barrier of Boston's elite. And that failure, that forces his next move, which is arguably the start of his true career in performance art.
Exactly. Having comprehensively failed to gain acceptance among the high society of Boston, who just found his manners and his persistent vulgarity completely intolerable, Dexter decided to retreat and basically create a world where he was the one who set the rules of taste and status.
So he relocates to Newburyport, Massachusetts. It's a significant coastal town, but with a somewhat less rigid class structure than Boston. It was easier for a self-made man to find footing.
But he wasn't interested in footing. He was interested in building a throne. In 1798, he buys a masterpiece of federal architecture, the Jonathan Jackson Estate, at 201 High Street.
And immediately he starts to
Well,
to systematically ruin its dignified aesthetic.
he did. He didn't want subtle wealth. He wanted inescapable, shouty spectacle. He transformed this mansion by adding bright paint, minarets, these gilt balls, extensive railings, and then he tops the cupola with a massive gilt eagle.
Sources describe the result as looking like Christmas gone mad.
Or from the harbor, a kind of garish, over-the-top Buckingham Palace of Newburyport. It was intentionally shocking. It was pure visual performance.
And the inside wasn't much better.
Not at all. He spent a fortune furnishing it. He had imported high-status items, including curtains that had supposedly belonged to the Queen of France. But the atmosphere was anything but dignified. The house quickly got a terrible reputation for loud, drunken parties and just the general chaos he fostered. It was labeled by contemporaries as a seedy pleasure dome.
And this domestic chaos, it spills into his relationship with his wife, Elizabeth. She was literally forced to move out of the house because of the parties, yet she stuck around, living nearby.
The Dexter's response to that was another layer of performance, all designed to control the narrative. He'd often tell curious visitors that his living wife, Elizabeth, was just a ghost. He'd refuse to acknowledge her presence, even when she was physically in the house.
It's this bizarre public attempt at psychological erasure.
He's treating his own wife as an inconvenient piece of furniture. It's really dark.
Okay, let's move to the ultimate component of the spectacle, the Museum of Idols, or what Dexter proudly called his mauseum.
Right. He commissions a local woodcarver, Joseph Wilson, to create about 40 monumental wooden statues. And these weren't small garden gnomes. These things were mounted on 15-foot pedestals and arrayed all around the house.
It must have been an unforgettable, bizarre landscape. It immediately drew tourists and crowds.
It was his version of Mount Rushmore crossed with a very bad flea market. The lineup was designed to reflect his own skewed view of history and, more importantly, his place in it.
He had the classics: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, who he placed atop a central arch. Then you had global figures like Napoleon Bonaparte and Louis XVI, the British statesman William Pitt the Elder.
But he mixed these historical heavyweights with complete allegorical nonsense, Venus, maternal affection, and even 4 lions and a lamb. It was a complete jumble, lacking any discernible theme except one.
Right, the ultimate purpose of the whole display, self-aggrandizement. The centerpiece was a statue of Dexter himself. And the inscription he insisted upon, it tells you everything you need to know about his monumental ego.
The inscription read, "I am the first in the East, the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the known world." He was literally putting himself above Washington and Jefferson in his own public narrative.
And he took the self-bestowed title Lord Timothy Dexter because, in his hilariously misspelled justification, it was the voice of the people at large.
He's just creating authority where none existed. But this public grandiosity wasn't just ego, though. It was, as you mentioned, brilliant performance strategy. The spectacle was so notorious that it turned Newburyport into a tourist destination. And since Dexter owned shares in local roads and bridges,
his absurdity became a quantifiable business asset.
he was leveraging fame, even negative fame, for profit. It's incredibly modern when you think about it.
And to complete the fantasy, he needed an entourage. He hired sycophants who would publicly validate his self-proclaimed nobility.
The most famous was Jonathan Plummer, whom Dexter appointed as his poet laureate. Plummer was a fascinating character himself. A fishmonger, a physician, a ballad seller. Dexter dressed him in this spectacular livery.
And instead of the traditional laurel wreath that you'd give a classic poet, Dexter crowned Plummer with a wreath of common parsley.
Parsley. And Plummer played his role perfectly. He'd compose these panegyrics and sell them in the street. Lines like, "Lord Dexter is a man of fame. Most celebrated is his name. In truth, he is great. In fact, is great." He was literally paying someone to write marketing jingles about him.
He also relied on the counsel of 2 other unusual figures. Madame Hooper, a fortune teller described as having a double set of teeth.
And Lucy Lancaster, known as Black Luce, a shrewd African woman who acted as his main advisor and notably his bodyguard.
A bodyguard.
Yeah. Luce's presence suggests the depth of the chaos. Dexter was notoriously short-tempered and prone to violence, especially when he was drinking. Luce was often the one required to step in and physically intervene when his erratic behavior became dangerous. This chaotic, expensive, and deeply theatrical life was the environment in which the famous Lucky Idiot Ventures were born.
Okay, now we arrive at the segment that cemented Lord Timothy Dexter in the annals of American folklore, the international trade ventures. Dexter decides to transition from land speculation to global commerce. He's buying ships like the Mahitable and the Congress.
And his rivals, the established, sensible Boston and Newburyport merchants, they see this as their final opportunity.
Their thinking was ruthless and simple.
Wow. We'll feed this fool the absolute worst business advice imaginable. He'll take these ridiculous, guaranteed-to-fail suggestions, sink his fortune in the Atlantic, and finally, humbly leave town. They just assumed his wealth from the Continental notes was pure, unrepeatable chance.
So the conspiracy began. And they started with the most famously ridiculous suggestion of all. Venture number one. They told him, with a straight face, to export 42,000 bed warming pans.
Devices specifically designed to heat cold New England beds in the dead of winter.
To the West Indies, a place universally known for its searing tropical climate.
The sheer volume and the absurdity of the product choice were designed to maximize his loss. I mean, we're talking about a colossal capital outlay here. Early biographers estimated that acquiring and shipping 42,000 specialized metal goods would have cost over $150,000 in hard currency at the time.
A staggering, almost impossible sum. It was clearly designed to bankrupt him in a single stroke.
So they waited. They waited for the news of his spectacular failure.
Instead, they got news of his spectacular success.
The legend states that a stroke of ingenuity, whether by Dexter's agents or the local buyers, intervened. The West Indies was experiencing a boom in molasses refinement. The local industries immediately repurposed the warming pans.
They used them as ladles.
They used the long handles and the wide metal bases as ladles and skimmers for the massive sugar and molasses plantations.
And he didn't just break even. He sold out every single one. He reportedly achieved a 79% markup on his catastrophic investment.
It was an unbelievable, confidence-shattering turnaround for his rivals. But they couldn't stop. So for venture number two, they attempted the ultimate logical impossibility: ship coal to Newcastle, England.
I mean, the phrase taking coal to Newcastle is literally the definition of a pointless, futile endeavor.
Because Newcastle was, and still is, one of the largest coal mining towns in the world. It was a joke proposition.
But Dexter, he took the joke seriously. He bought up tons of anthracite coal and dispatched his ship across the Atlantic.
And what his rivals failed to account for was timing. When Dexter's shipment arrived, Newcastle was paralyzed by a massive, weeks-long coal miners' strike that had crippled local production.
He arrived effectively as the town's only available coal supplier.
He sold his entire supply immediately at a massive premium price. The sources describe the profit as stunning. He returned to Newburyport with a barrel and a half of silver, a king's ransom.
So their attempt to destroy him with a parentless task resulted in him exploiting a perfect, though rare, labor stoppage.
You can almost feel their frustration. How about venture number three? They suggest he round up Newburyport's stray cats and ship them across the ocean to the Caribbean.
A ludicrously dumb idea by any standard.
And again, the setup failed spectacularly. The Caribbean plantations and coastal warehouses were suffering from a severe, widespread rat infestation, likely carried over by ships from Europe. The demand for reliable mousers was acute.
So the stray New England cats were instantly purchased.
Exactly. Sold as effective biological control agents at a premium. Dexter profited immensely yet again. It's difficult to maintain the narrative of the lucky fool when his success is this consistent against calculated sabotage.
Then there's the sheer financial savvy or luck involved in his speculation on raw materials. Venture 4 involves Dexter investing heavily in whale bones. He acquires 340 tons of them.
Right. And whalebone, or baleen, was the primary flexible structural material of the era. It was like the plastic of the 1800s, used in everything from buggy whips to umbrella ribs.
And Dexter, possibly by simple chance, corners the market just as a major French fashion shift creates this massive, unanticipated demand for whale bones to be used in corsets.
This sounds less like luck and more like market manipulation achieved through high liquidity. He bought low, accumulating the material while others ignored it, and then sold high, exploiting a sudden global fashion trend he likely only heard about secondhand.
He even managed to make money selling religion. Venture 5. Ship thousands of Bibles to the West Indies, a region not exactly known for its sudden, overwhelming demand for wholesale scripture. He buys 21,000 Bibles wholesale at a deep discount, about 41 cents each.
This success highlights his ability to leverage circumstances. I mean, one colorful, maybe apocryphal account claims he sent a note saying locals would go to hell if they didn't buy one.
It sounds like him.
It does. But the more plausible historical account suggests that a sudden influx of missionaries arrived in the area shortly after his ship landed.
And the missionaries, needing supplies immediately, bought the entire inventory wholesale.
Precisely. They bought all 21,000 Bibles, netting Dexter a reported profit of around $47,000. It's the perfect example of his ability to capitalize on the unpredictable logistics of early international trade.
And finally, Venture 6, sending wool mittens to the South Sea Islands, another tropical location where warm hand coverings are about as necessary as those warming pans.
And of course, they sold out. Portuguese traders already in the region bought the entire supply for immediate export to the truly cold climates of China and Siberia via existing long-distance trade routes.
So every attempt to sabotage him only amplified his wealth. The narrative of Lord Timothy Dexter is now fully formed. He is the chaotic, uneducated, bombastic individual who succeeds by making every conceivable mistake, defying all known laws of economics and probability.
At this point, the defeated rivals aren't just broke, they are fundamentally questioning their reality. They have succeeded only in turning Dexter into an absolute legend.
The financial success only fueled Dexter's pathological vanity and his desperate need for public spectacle, leading to some of his most bizarre and, frankly, darkest stunts. This chaotic energy seems to have reached its peak with the mock funeral.
The mock funeral it's difficult to understand outside the context of his extreme narcissism. Driven by a desire to witness his own posthumous glory and, judge the reaction of his peers, he staged his own death and funeral years before he actually died.
And he didn't do this half-heartedly. He went to immense trouble and expense. He prepared a magnificent mahogany coffin, superbly lined, fitted with silver handles.
He reportedly kept it in his house and even slept in it for weeks to test out its comfort. He also built a custom tomb in the basement of his summer house, open to the light of day.
The event itself was a huge spectacle. About 3,000 people attended.
Drawn primarily by the promise of free food, expensive alcohol, and just the inherent curiosity of witnessing the funeral of the great Lord Timothy Dexter, Dexter naturally was watching the whole affair unfold from a hidden spot.
A hired wag performed this service, reading this wildly bombastic eulogy. But the problem arose when Dexter, watching his wife Elizabeth, realized she wasn't performing the required amount of grief.
She wasn't crying, which infuriated his ego. And this is where the absurdity turns genuinely disturbing. Unable to tolerate the slight, Dexter reportedly jumped out of his hiding place. He rushed into the kitchen, found Elizabeth, and began beating her brutally with a cane in front of the astonished guests for failing to mourn him sufficiently.
Wait, let's just pause there for a moment. This level of theatrical violence, witnessed by 3,000 people, is shocking. Was this typical for the household?
Sadly, the sources suggest it was. His violent temper and his propensity for drunken rage were well documented. It often required Black Luce to physically restrain him. The mock funeral merely provided the most public stage for his domestic abuse. He was using his wealth and performance to control not just the public narrative, but his family's reality.
And after the assault, he just returns to the party.
He joins the party. He was reportedly satisfied with the turnout, throwing handfuls of money from the window to the crowd of boys outside. The spectacle was more important than the trauma he caused.
The performance was a success in his mind.
And then, at age 50, he decided he needed to cement his philosophical legacy, which gives us his bizarre memoir, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, or Plain Truths in a Homespun Dress.
The title itself is a dig at the educated elite, the knowing ones who always look down on him.
Precisely. The book is an 8,000-word literary train wreck, but its cultural impact was enormous. It was a muddled rant complaining about the clergy, politicians, and inevitably his wife, whom he consistently referred to as the ghost.
And the style is what makes it legendary. Atrocious spelling, random capitalization, like writing Jane Roll for General, and Jorge Washington for George Washington.
And a complete, deliberate lack of punctuation. It must have been visually and linguistically exhausting to read.
But he genuinely believed he was writing a masterpiece.
He boasted that his work would be remembered long after the likes of Shakespeare and Milton were forgotten. He includes gems like, "I have hard knocks on my head 4 different times," and his bold, self-promoting claim, "I'm the first lord in the United States of Mercury. Now of Newburyport, it is the voice of the people, and I can't help it."
The book was so outlandish, it became an instant cultural sensation, a kind of proto-viral oddity. It was initially given away for free, but it went through 8 printings, purely because people couldn't believe what they were reading.
But when readers complained, and they complained vehemently about the complete, bewildering lack of punctuation in the first edition.
This is in 1802.
Right. And Dexter's response, in the second edition of 1805, is the ultimate troll move.
He didn't fix the grammar, did he?
Oh, no. He added an entire separate page of punctuation marks, 11 lines packed tight with commas, semicolons, colons, question marks, and exclamation points.
And he told his readers to do what with them?
His instruction was to cut them out and stick them wherever they please. Or, in his exact, glorious, misspelled words, they may pepper and salt it as they please.
That is absurd genius. He externalized the entire labor of grammar and editing. He turned the physical book into a piece of interactive conceptual art.
He's challenging the reader to impose order on his chaos. It's an act of literary rebellion that was centuries ahead of its time. It elevates the text from mere illiteracy to deliberate strategy. By inviting the reader to become a collaborator, he fundamentally mocks the entire notion of fixed literary standards.
It proves that the spectacle was his real medium. But beneath all that, the real-world chaos had tragic consequences. His domestic life was far from humorous.
No, it was heartbreaking. His son Samuel spiraled into reckless alcoholism and died young. His daughter, Nancy, married poorly, divorced, and tragically lost her feeble wits, living in intemperance until her own death decades later. The chaos he engineered for public consumption was extremely painful for those closest to him. So, we have now successfully laid out the legendary story. The fortunate, uneducated buffoon who accidentally succeeded where every sensible merchant failed, earning fame and fortune through pure, spectacular luck. This is the narrative that has survived for over 2 centuries.
But this is the deep dive, and we are not here to simply retell the legend. You're suggesting, quite radically, that the stories that made him immortal, the warming pans, coal to Newcastle, the cats, were basically manufactured fiction, a self-serving fabrication.
Exactly. We need to introduce the voice of skepticism, the historians who questioned the logistics long ago. We're applying the critical thinking that Dexter himself seemed to encourage, even in his mockery. The key is the analysis provided by early biographers and scholars like William Cleves Todd.
Okay, so what specifically did Todd and his contemporaries question? Beyond just the general absurdity, what was the hard evidence against the lucky fool narrative?
Well, the primary argument centers on financial and logistical implausibility. Let's go back to the warming pans. Todd argued that the story defies reality because of the sheer cost. Shipping 42,000 bed warming pans would have cost a conservative estimate of $150,000 in hard currency.
An astronomical sum for a merchant to risk on a single, obviously terrible speculation. So even if he had the money, that level of risk on a joke commodity is just mathematically absurd for the time period.
Furthermore, the logistical details of the triumph don't hold up. Todd noted that warming pans are poorly adapted to serve as ladles for molasses refinement, and the demand in the West Indies for sugar production tools, while high, would not have supported a consignment of 42,000 units. It just doesn't scale.
So the story might have originated from a small, successful sale of a few dozen pans, which Dexter then magnified.
40,000-fold. And if these high-volume international transactions, the coal, the whalebone, the 21,000 Bibles, if they were real, they should have caused a seismic event in the merchant community. They should have been recorded.
In official documents.
Absolutely. But critics note a distinct lack of documentation. No record of these specific, high-volume, cross-Atlantic shipments could be found in the Newburyport Custom House books, which rigorously logged every major international transaction. The consensus among the skeptical biographers is that these stories are essentially tall tales that Dexter, the master performer and self-promoter, amplified into legend.
Okay, so if he wasn't lucky, what was he? If he consciously invented the narrative of the lucky fool to deflect scrutiny, that makes him a highly calculating, sophisticated performance artist and a financial manipulator.
Which leads to alternative theory 1. Dexter was actually a shrewd businessman who weaponized his reputation for absurdity. He may have used the persona of the idiot to confuse his rivals while having superior, quiet market knowledge. Remember, he had the liquidity from the Continental notes to corner a market, like with the 340 tons of whalebone.
He could afford to buy and hold, forcing market price shifts. That's not a fool, that's a monopolist.
Precisely. Sarah Anna Emery, a contemporary scholar, supported this nuanced view. She argued that even though he was ignorant and illiterate in the classical sense, he was shrewd and sagacious when it came to trade. He recognized that cornering a market or exploiting a rare event like the Newcastle strike was worth the calculated risk. The sources show he often inquired specifically about which goods were scarce and then just tripled the price upon arrival.
That's a deliberate, ruthless business model.
It is. Which brings us to alternative theory 2, the proto-troll. His actions were a deliberate strategy of spectacle as strategy. He couldn't earn acceptance by conforming to the elite's rules, so he decided to achieve fame and immortality by openly mocking those rules. This connects perfectly to modern behavior.
He was a master of the attention economy.
Completely. The tacky house, the bizarre statues, the unpunctuated book all were engineered to overwhelm his critics with sheer audacity and financial power. He understood that negative attention, if loud enough and backed by mountains of cash, could be converted directly into social capital and enduring fame. He was effectively trolling the entire society of Newburyport.
The writer Oliver Wendell Holmes even suggested that America's real declaration of literary independence didn't come from Emerson or Thoreau, but from Lord Timothy Dexter.
Holmes argued that Dexter, who disdained all rules and convention, must yield the claim of declaring American literary independence. His book became popular not despite its flaws, but because it was such an unprecedented oddity. He was a precursor to radical American literary figures because his work was a pure act of rebellion against structure.
So the ultimate genius of Dexter is that he recognized the power of persona. If you can create a legend so captivating, the man who succeeds by doing everything wrong, nobody bothers to look too closely at the underlying mechanics of your finances or the logistics of your shipping records.
He was a self-written, self-published legend. He bypassed the traditional gatekeepers of taste, history, and literature, cementing his place in history by appearing as the greatest philosopher in his own chaotic, self-made world. He achieved the immortality he craved not by being good, but by being the most famous, wealthy, and successful joke.
So, having successfully trolled the knowing ones for decades and rewriting the rules of commerce and literature, Lord Timothy Dexter died, this time for real, on October 26, 1806. He was 59.
And his final estate valuation offers one more piece of cold, hard data supporting the idea that his spectacular wealth was likely exaggerated or just rapidly spent on his lavish lifestyle and vanity projects. His estate was valued at a relatively modest $35,027.
Which is certainly not poor. That's about $800,000 today. But it's a far cry from the multi-millionaire status his legendary shipping ventures would imply. It suggests that much of his success was narrative, not cash reserves.
And in a final, fitting snub from the town he tried to dominate, Newburyport's Board of Health denied his dying wish to be buried in his magnificent, purpose-built garden tomb. They cited sanitary grounds.
Essentially saying his presence would contaminate the neighborhood even in death.
The man who spent weeks sleeping in his custom mahogany coffin ended up being interred in the common burying place, the Old Hill Burying Ground, marked by a relatively simple stone, stripped of the grandiosity he so desperately sought.
And his physical spectacle, the 40 or so monumental wooden statues that surrounded his mansion, his mausoleum, they didn't fare much better in the face of nature and time.
No, they fell into severe disrepair very quickly. The sources note that the catastrophic Great September Gale of 1815 knocked most of them down, and the survivors, made of common wood and poorly maintained, were sold for as little as $1 or just burned for firewood by later owners who found them tacky.
But, as we mentioned at the very top of this deep dive, the saga of William Pitt the Elder is the single crucial thread that survived, physically connecting Dexter's early 1800s vision to our modern day.
That statue's journey is truly unique. It's the only complete figure that survived the gale and the subsequent sales. However, it was badly damaged by rotten carpenter ants.
And the drastic measures taken to save it sound like a conservator's worst nightmare.
They were. An early collector, Edna Little Greenwood, acquired it. And to maintain its stability, the desperate measure was taken to fill the 9-foot wooden statue with concrete.
Concrete in a wooden sculpture. That must have been a conservation headache when it finally reached a museum setting.
Oh, absolutely. Greenwood donated Pitt to the Smithsonian in 1951. It underwent a meticulous 2-year restoration process, which included the painstaking work of chipping out all that concrete before it was displayed in Washington, D.C. for decades.
But the story has a happy ending, bringing the relic of the great troll home.
Since 1994, it had been on loan to the Museum of Old Newbury, sitting just up the street from where Dexter first erected it. And after years of repeated requests and careful negotiation, the Smithsonian officially transferred permanent ownership in January of 2025. It is now secured as a one-of-a-kind example of early American outdoor sculpture, a permanent icon of Dexter's disruptive presence.
The ultimate survivor of Lord Timothy Dexter's chaotic vision has finally found its permanent piece, secured by the very institutions of taste and history that he dedicated his life to mocking. #outro. So we have concluded this deep dive, and we are left with 2 competing portraits of Lord Timothy Dexter. Was he the uneducated buffoon who succeeded only because fate kept twisting his terrible advice into enormous profit? Or was he the strategic visionary who weaponized absurdity and wealth to troll an entire society into remembering him?
Given the massive financial implausibility of the legendary ventures, the complete lack of verifiable shipping records, and his absolute compulsive obsession with public spectacle, the evidence leans heavily toward the latter. Dexter recognized that if the elite, the knowing ones, would not accept him on their terms, well, he could become immortal by creating a narrative they couldn't ignore.
He was a living embodiment of the performative economy. He anticipated the dynamics of fame engineered by provocation and spectacle as strategy. He understood branding before there were brands and trolling before there was a timeline.
He realized that sometimes being the loudest, most outrageous figure, even if you're wrong, can be far more effective than being the quietest, most correct businessman.
And that leads us back to his ultimate provocation. His book, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. Dexter promised readers that they could put the punctuation wherever they pleased.
The great irony is that Lord Timothy Dexter, the man who couldn't spell and use a comma, left behind a legacy where modern society is still arguing over how to properly interpret and structure his story.
We are still trying to figure out where to put the periods and the exclamation points.
The real pickle is realizing that we are all still the knowing ones he was trying to confuse. The conversation about Timothy Dexter is just a continued attempt to put commas and periods on his chaotic, brilliant, and deeply absurd life.
That is a fascinating thought to mull over. We may never solve the puzzle, but we have certainly gained a massive appreciation for the performance. Thank you for diving into the beautiful, chaotic mind of Lord Timothy Dexter.
Always a pleasure to unpack the truly strange corners of history.
And thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope we've saved you a few centuries of confusion and provided you with enough ammunition to win your next debate about the origin of American literary independence. We'll see you next time.